The first thing anybody says when they're comparing full frame to APS-C, and especially Micro Four Thirds, is the sensor size. They say the sensor size is too small. I've heard it again and again in forums, YouTube comment sections, even YouTube videos from photographers and non-photographers, enthusiasts alike. Everybody says Micro Four Thirds, the sensor's too small. It can't be taken seriously. It's not professional. It's like a toy camera. Real professionals need APS-C or full frame. And I hear a lot of arguments that, full frame in fact is, though it's nice, it's kind of outdated, it's overrated. APS-C does everything full frame does, and in many cases it gives you a lot of advantages over full frame. And basically nobody argues that APS-C is not professional enough or not capable enough, especially with Fujifilm's prevalence in the market these days. But everyone says that Micro Four Thirds is too small. The sensor's just not big enough. The problem with that is when we compare an APS-C size sensor to a full frame sensor, we can see that there's actually a very big difference. Now, if this is what's considered negligible, if they say that, although it looks like a big difference, the final result, thanks to other aspects of the camera, the camera's not just an image sensor, and the computational aspects and whatnot, they say the final result, end of the day, this size difference is negligible. These days it doesn't make that much big of a difference because APS-C is so good in the modern era. But to give you an idea of the size difference, it's not just what you can see in front of you here, but it's also a multiplication factor. An APS-C sensor has an area of 368 square millimeters, whereas a full frame sensor has an area of 864 square millimeters, which means a full frame sensor is 2.3 times larger than APS-C. Literally takes almost 2.5 APS-C sensors to equal one full frame sensor. But remember, according to a lot of people these days, especially Fujifilm users, since they're the main ones that are credited for this, APS-C is just as professional as full frame. It can outperform full frame in some cases or many cases, and this size difference is negligible. The irony comes in is that the same people who say this is professional and its size difference to full frame is negligible say that Micro Four Thirds is too small. It's tiny, minuscule, itty bitty, too small. But if we look at these side by side, we see that Micro Four Thirds and APS-C are almost the exact same size. APS-C is bigger, but not by much. If you notice side by side, APS-C is just a little bit taller. The main size difference comes from the sides. An APS-C sensor is a 3:2 aspect ratio, whereas Micro Four Thirds is a 4:3 aspect ratio. So it's got some width added to the sides. That's the primary difference. And as far as multiplication goes, the area, the surface area of the Micro Four Thirds sensor is 225 millimeters squared, and it's still the same 368 on the APS-C. That means an APS-C sensor is only 1.6 times larger than a Micro Four Thirds sensor. And this is assuming that you're talking about the big APS-C sensors, the ones found in Nikon and Sony and Fujifilm. If we were talking about Canon, we know that those are even smaller than this. But to keep it easy, we can say this is the real world size difference. Now, I fail to understand how comparing these two, you can tell me that it's a negligible size difference, that this is almost the same size as this. It's not such a big leap, it's not such a big jump. This is just as professional, and so on and so forth. But this sensor is just too small. It's nowhere near big enough. This one is massive compared to this one. Doesn't make any sense. The next thing I hear people talk about is the pixel size, which is actually, they're on the right track. Despite popular belief, the surface area, the size of a sensor itself, has nothing to do with its performance. Now, there are a lot of aspects to how well a camera will perform. We all know that depending on what era the camera came out in, depends on a lot of the quality of the hardware being used. Silicon wafers and the computational aspects and how, how it can process information like the SNR firmware and things like that. All those things being aside, because it's a lot to dive into, and I am not afraid to admit I don't understand those complexities well enough to speak about them in an educated manner. All that aside, when it comes to the physical sensor itself, although there are some differences like CCD versus CMOS or BSI versus no BSI, the primary difference in a sensor's performance comes to the pixel size. This is what you hear people like the angry photographer call big eyeballs. The size of the sensor itself, or the photo site, the pixel pitch, has to do with how big the eyeballs are, how much it can see, how much information it can draw in. All things being equal, the larger the pixel, the more information it can bring in. And of course, again, as the computational aspects improve over the years, we can derive more information from smaller pixels, but all things being equal, larger pixels are generally better. So you hear people say, well, it's not so much the surface area of a micro four thirds sensor, it's the pixel size. Now this is a good start, they're right. The surface area of a sensor has nothing to do with its performance. It is the pixel size. The size of an individual pixel really helps determine how much information it can bring in, how much light it can take in. But the problem comes that people don't seem to really understand just how identical the sizes are between pixels of different formats. To give you an example, a micro four thirds sensor with 16 megapixels has the exact same pixel size as an APS-C sensor with 26 megapixels. The APS-C sensor is larger, so it can fit more of those pixels in there, resulting in a higher overall resolution, but the pixel size is the exact same between a 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor and a 26 megapixel APS-C sensor. It is also the exact same size as a 61 megapixel full frame sensor. And if you scale up that 61 megapixel full frame sensor to what we call a small medium format like the GFX series, it comes out to 100 megapixels. And if you scale that up to a large medium format like a phase 1 camera, it comes out to 150 megapixels. Now, what's crazy is that I didn't make these numbers up and I didn't force them to work. I look at the actual surface area of the sensor, look at the resolution of that sensor, and then just do the math. You divide. You find out how big each pixel must be in order to fit that many pixels into a sensor that size. We all know that micro four thirds cameras many times have been 16 megapixels. The current generation is 20, but for a long time they were 16 megapixels, and some of the entry-level ones still are 16 megapixels. When you scale that up to the APS-C being 26 megapixels, you're talking about basically every current Fujifilm camera. Whether it's the X-T30, X-T3, X Pro 3, the coming X-T4, those are all 26 megapixel cameras. 61 megapixels on a full frame, you're talking about the Sony a7R4. It's a full frame camera with 61 megapixels. A GFX sized medium format sensor with 100 megapixels, you already know we're talking about the GFX 100. It's a GFX sized small medium format with 100 megapixels. And a phase 1 camera with 150 megapixels, we're talking about the phase 1 IQ4. It's a 150 megapixel phase 1 camera. So in these examples, each of those cameras has a different sensor size. From smallest to large, it goes from micro four thirds to APS-C to full frame, GFX, and then phase 1. But the pixel size, the size of each individual pixel, the photo site, the pixel pitch, is the exact same across all of those cameras. The only difference is that with a larger sensor you can fit more of those pixels into that area, so you end up with a higher base resolution. And that's when people start talking about the high ISO or low light capabilities of micro four thirds. It's just as good as full frame, as APS-C or anything else. Again, we see drastic differences in the performance of one full frame camera versus another, or one APS-C camera versus another. An X-T3 is going to have drastically different performance than a Ryko GR. or a Nikon D850 is going to have drastically different performance than a Canon 5D Mark IV. And the reason why comes down to all that extra stuff I talked about. The computational aspect. What kind of magic they're working behind the scenes with the information they've derived from their sensor. And of course there are some small sensor differences. For example, the pixel count makes a difference, because the pixel count then determines the pixel size. If one camera is a BSI, for example, the D850's BSI, the 5D Mark IV isn't. But all things being equal, even if you look at two full-frame cameras with the same resolution, you're going to see different performance between the two, thanks to all those extra aspects. Same with APS-C or Micro Four Thirds or anything else. Having said that, there is no drastic difference between the performance of a Micro Four Thirds camera versus an APS-C or a full frame. It is about as negligible as the difference seen when comparing one full frame to another. For example, the Nikon D850 has an ISO score of 4,115 based on photons2photos.com. It's a much better source for information than DxOMark. According to Photons to Photos, the D850 with its full-frame BSI sensor has scored a ISO score of 4,115, which is especially high for a full-frame camera. It's really high. It's a very good score even by full-frame standards. And that's no surprise. Everyone knows the D850 is a phenomenal, fantastic camera. It has a lot of good tech put into it. The BSI sensor made a huge difference. No surprise there. But that same website with the same testing protocols showed that the Olympus EM1 Mark II scored 3,603. And while it's not as good as the D850, which could just come down to the BSI and some other little algorithms, it is better than the Nikon D810. The Olympus EM1 Mark II, a Micro Four Thirds camera, has a better ISO score than the Nikon D810, a full frame camera. It's also better than the Fuji X-T3, which is not technically a flagship, but a flagship level APS-C camera. Because Micro Four Thirds sensors typically use the exact same pixel size as that's found on an APS-C sensor or a full frame sensor, there is no negative hit to their performance in ISO or dynamic range. Dynamic range being the next thing people call out. They say, well, I really need a camera with great dynamic range. Micro Four Thirds sensors too small, or pixels are too small, or insert excuse here, doesn't have good dynamic range. Now, again, the problem with that is that while the EM1 Mark II is especially good in low light, something like the Panasonic G9 was actually tuned for dynamic range. It is especially good with dynamic range. I think it's the best Micro Four Thirds camera for dynamic range that's been tested so far. The Panasonic G9 has the same dynamic range as the Fujifilm X-T3, a camera that is known for having great dynamic range, has the BSI sensor, and all the Fuji magic. The G9 has the same dynamic range. It has better dynamic range than full-frame cameras like the Nikon DF or the D4, which are full-frame, very expensive professional cameras that are known, they are notorious for having great dynamic range. The Panasonic G9 actually has better dynamic range than the Nikon D5, Canon 5DS or DSR, the Leica M monochrome, basically any of the second generation Fujis, whether you're talking about the X Pro 2, XH1, XH2, full frame or APS-C, the G9 has better dynamic range than those cameras. Because again, it comes down to not only the computational aspect, but the size of the pixels, not the size of the sensor itself. And people say, well, yeah, okay, but you know, I print my photos, or I might want to print my photos, and I might want to do a really large print, and everyone knows you can't do large prints with a Micro Four Thirds camera. I feel like I don't even need to hit on this very much, because even the most modest searching on YouTube or Google or anything, and like immediately disproves this. That's a horrible myth. I don't know who started that, but print size is determined by viewing distance. As the print gets bigger, the viewing distance increases. And not because they tell you it should, but because it has to. If a photo is 1 inch across, you're going to hold it really close to, like, what is that? Whereas if a photo is the size of a building, you're not going to look at it from here because you won't see anything. You have to stand back quite a bit in order to see the photo. So as the photo gets bigger, so does the viewing distance. And because of that very simple fact of life, basically any camera within reason can print to any size within reason. Again, I don't feel like I really need to harp on this too much, but if you're still of the camp that you believe that micro Four Thirds cameras can't do large prints, I would suggest you look at YouTube. There's pro photographers who have posted videos of themselves delivering gallery quality prints to clients that are 7 feet across, shot with old, outdated micro Four Thirds cameras, and it's absolutely not even the slightest bit degradation in quality. There have been tests where they test micro Four Thirds against full frame, that do huge prints, and then they have professionals in the print industry look and they can't tell which camera shot which. Even Joe Edelman, he notoriously had a lot of his photos done as large prints, whether they're for trade shows or whatnot, but he had a photo from his EM1 Mark II made to be 48 feet wide, I believe it was. 48 feet wide. And it held up fine. So I'm not going to go any further with that, but I will say that there's no problem with large prints. As far as the resolution goes, it's crazy because there was a time when DSLRs and cameras were 4 megapixels and 6 megapixels and things like that, and 8 megapixels, 10 megapixels. Now, a lot of that had to do with just because they couldn't do more at the time, but honestly, the area where the technology kind of caught up to the standard of what needs to be, what we actually require, was right around 10 years ago or so. 12 megapixels is about the perfect, most versatile resolution. That's why a lot of phones are still 12 megapixels, despite the fact that they've proven they can go over 100 megapixels. That's why most cameras for years and years and years, whether they were entry level or on up to professional, were 12 megapixels, because typically it doesn't matter what sensor size you're using, it doesn't matter what you're doing with the photo, it doesn't matter what environment you shoot in, 12 megapixels is basically always enough. I mean, I talked about it in my Nikon D3S video. That was a 12 megapixel camera. Not only did it look tack sharp no matter what I did, but I could crop in. I cropped my photos all the time and they still look tack sharp. You have to remember that if you have a screen that's a 1080 megapixel screen, or 1080 resolution screen, a 1080 image, 1920 by 1080, is a 2 megapixel image. It's 2 megapixels. And you have people with these 2 megapixel moving images on their screen blown up to 32-inch monitors and even bigger. They even have TVs in their living room that are 50-inch TVs that are 1080. So it's a 2 megapixel resolution stretched to 50, 60, 70 inches, and nobody feels like it looks bad because, again, the viewing distance increases. If you go up to 4K, the insanely high resolution, that's only 8 megapixels. I think 6K is something like 18 megapixels. Basically, and even in all those scenarios, those are video files. The video files are never as crisp and sharp and detailed as an actual raw photo. So if you have a camera that's shooting raw photos at 12 megapixels, it is way more detailed and way more sharp than honestly anybody ever really requires. However, we do like having our options. We like to have our cake and eat it too. And we like to be able to know that there's extra resolution in case we want it for whatever reason. And that's why nowadays there's super high res cameras. But that's more of a measuring contest, like look what I can do. When it comes to actual performance, like balancing what the camera needs to be able to do versus really good image quality, the magic ratio seems to be about 20 megapixels. If you look at the Nikon D5, the upcoming D6, the Canon 1DX Mark II or Mark III, the Nikon D500 or the Z50, those are all 20 megapixel cameras. And they're professional cameras. The D5, D6, 1DX, those are all flagship $6,000 cameras. The Nikon D500 is considered the best APS-C camera Nikon ever made. It's all 20 megapixels. So when you have the Panasonic G9 or the Olympus EM1 Mark II or 3 with 20 megapixels, and people start throwing shade at that like it's not high res enough, I think that's, they're just looking for excuses to not like the camera. They're looking for ways to throw shade at it. It's absolutely high enough resolution and more than you'd ever need. However, they do have you covered. If you ever decide that you want to play that medium format game and you've decided that you want to use a super ridiculous like Laowa 7.5mm rectilinear lens for landscape photography, and then you also want to zoom in and crop at 1000% and then take that 1000% crop and then use that as a blown up image you're going to put on your wall and still have it look really good, you can do that because the Micro Four Thirds cameras have high res shot mode where you end up with, you know, depending on which camera it is, 70 or 80 or whatever megapixels, insanely high resolution raw files that, again, in every lab test that's ever been conducted shows it's on par quality wise with an actual medium format camera. So resolution is never a problem with Micro Four Thirds cameras. One of the big benefits to Micro Four Thirds is the savings in weight. And I'm not talking about the bodies. Anybody who says, look at how big that new Micro Four Thirds camera is, it's just as big as a DSLR, you're not saving any weight, I don't think they've ever actually owned a camera. Because any photographer or even enthusiast knows that a camera is useless without a lens, and a lens, especially when you're not using a kit lens, once you start using professional lenses, that's where the size and the weight comes from. That's where you're saving. And along with those professional lenses comes big price tags. So I hear a lot of people complaining that one, you don't really save any weight with modern Micro Four Thirds because the lenses are too big and the bodies are too big. And they also say, like with the EM1 Mark III that just came out, everyone's saying, wow, that's way too expensive for a Micro Four Thirds camera. As if the fact that there's a smaller sensor in the camera has anything to do with the price or like the quality of the camera or what it can do or what the price should be. But to tackle both of those things, I'll give you an example. If you wanted to just have the trinity of lenses, the holy trinity, you know, like your wide angle zoom, your standard zoom, and your telephoto zoom, just those three lenses. For Nikon, those three lenses together would weigh 3.43 kilograms or about 7.5 pounds, and it would cost you $5,700 for those three lenses. If you were a Canon shooter, that same trinity of lenses would cost, well, they would weigh 2.9 kilograms, which is around 6.5 pounds, and would cost you $5,300. If you are a Fuji shooter, then the Fuji's version of those three lenses would weigh 2.46 kilograms, which is about 5.5 pounds, would cost you $4,800. So these prices are coming down, but not substantially. But if you're a Micro Four Thirds shooter, one of the benefits you have as Micro Four Thirds is, one, there's an insane selection of lenses. If I wanted to get just the wide angle lens, I could say, well, do I want the Olympus 9-18, f4 to 5.6, because that's super compact and cheap. Or do I want something like the 7-14, but I still want it to be compact and light? Panasonic has the 7-14 f4. If you want something more substantial, a little more professional with a faster aperture, Olympus has a 7-14 f2.8 Pro. And if you prefer the focal length of a 16-35 like Canon, and you want that Leica optics, you know, or so they say, then Panasonic has the Panasonic Leica 8-18 f2.8 to 4. So let me preface that by saying there's a lot of options as far as how much you want to spend or how big or small you want these lenses. But based on what the most popular choices are, and going with the more professional lenses, the more heavy lenses, if you had the trio of Micro Four Thirds lenses, then the trio together would weigh 0.98 kilograms, less than a kilogram, which is about 2 pounds, a little more than 2 pounds. And it would cost you $3,200. So people say you're not really saving any weight with this modern lenses for Micro Four Thirds. well, even buying the big heavy ones, the micro four thirds system weighs about 1/4 of what the Nikon setup weighs, and it weighs almost a third of what the Fuji setup weighs. And they say you're not saving any money. It costs almost nearly half of what the Nikon setup weighs, or it costs. So you're saving many thousands of dollars, and you're saving a ton of weight by doing micro four thirds. And they're not sacrificing optical quality at all. Again, I'm not going to harp on that too long, but there are many tests, both real world and lab results, that show micro four thirds lenses are amazingly high quality. You're not sacrificing anything quality wise, but you're saving a lot of money, and you are saving a lot of weight. Not to mention, thanks to the aspect ratio, that 4:3 aspect ratio, you can really shrink the lenses down, because with APS-C, because it's shorter but it's wider, so even though it's not using the top section of that image circle it's projecting, it still has to stretch all the way out to the sides. Well, the micro four thirds isn't much shorter than an APS-C, but it is narrower. So the entire image circle can actually shrink down quite a bit. This means that smaller elements can be used in the lenses, and the overall lens itself, even two relatively equal lenses, the micro four thirds lens can actually be much smaller and much lighter because it has a drastically smaller image circle. And it also means that if you want to adapt lenses to micro four thirds cameras, you have more options than adapting lenses to any other camera in the world. And this one is one that it really irritates me, because I can see both sides of the argument, but I can never understand the result. On the one hand, I love tech specs. I love it when a camera can theoretically do everything I could ever want and more. But I also know from experience and from my love of photography that a camera doesn't need all that. Some of my favorite cameras of all time have been cameras that didn't have great tech specs, especially by today's standards, but they were wonderful cameras. But what I have noticed is that it's an actual trend in the industry these days for camera manufacturers, is that they keep on trying to find ways to increase their profits despite what's happening with the market. And they've tried different things. Nikon seems to just be failing in general. Everyone was mad about the single card slot. Canon did the same thing, but they came out with their mirrorless cameras. They said it was going to be a mirrorless version of the D850 if you got the Z7, but it's missing a lot of the stuff the D850 has. Not just the dual card slots. It's actually missing a lot of stuff. It's absolutely not a mirrorless D850. Just like the Z6, although it's a great camera, it's not nearly what it was supposed to be. Everyone said the EOS R was supposed to be a mirrorless 5D Mark IV, but it's missing a lot of stuff. That seems to be a common thing. Canon is notorious for having their cripple hammer. Nikon is just financially stressed and apparently can't afford to make good cameras anymore. The latest rumors I heard said that one of the reasons why the D6 seems so similar to the D5 is because Nikon just doesn't have the current finances to back any real R&D, and to really make a better camera, they have to upgrade the D5 as quickly and cheaply as possible to try and maximize their profits, because they can't afford anything else. Fujifilm has kind of lost sight of their roots. They've started discontinuing their film stocks in order to push people towards their digital side, and whereas when Fujifilm was a smaller company with less money, everything they have was made in Japan. Now they're a bigger company with more money, and they're starting to make a lot of stuff in China. And I know there's this whole semantics about made in versus assembled in, and it's a horseshit argument. It's made in China. The bottom of the camera says made in China. The literature from Fujifilm says made in China. So you can go through a fine-tooth comb and decide which part of the semantics you're going to argue, but it went from everything proudly being made domestically in Japan to stuff being outsourced to China. However, when you buy a professional level micro four thirds camera, you get everything. Micro four thirds cameras are the front runners. Let's start by saying that. The reason why any camera has half the features it has today is thanks to companies like Olympus and Panasonic. They're the ones who first came out with IBIS. They're the ones who first came out with 4K video in the cameras. They're the ones who first came out with super fast frame rates, especially using an electronic shutter. They're the ones that came out with the first ones to have the fully articulating touch screens and the super high resolution, gigantic built-in EVFs and things like that. All these features that people now hope that their full frame or APS-C camera will have, and are considered kind of wish list items, started out with Micro Four Thirds. And Micro Four Thirds cameras, whether it be Panasonic or Olympus, they've never turned their back on that. They still, if they're selling you a professional camera, whether it's the GH5 or the G9 or the EM1 Mark II or 3, it will have everything. Everything they know how to make will be shoved into that camera. And of course, people talk about, well, if Micro Four Thirds cameras are so good, why don't professionals use them? And the answer is actually really simple. A lot of professionals do use Micro Four Thirds. Some people know about Joe Edelman, a famous professional photographer who's been doing it for a long time, who shoots Olympus exclusively. And some people know that Darren Miles, he started out with Micro Four Thirds. Some people also know that, was it Red 35? He started out, or he started out with Canon, I believe, but now he's full on Micro Four Thirds, I believe specifically Olympus. But it's not just these YouTube personalities. There are a lot, like a ton of industry-leading professional photographers who shoot Micro Four Thirds. I actually went on the website the other day and I was seeing guys like photojournalists and travel photographers and wildlife photographers and sports photographers who have decades of experience, who have been doing this professionally at the highest level for 30 plus years, and they specifically shoot either Olympus or Panasonic. My dad's been shooting Olympus for 17 years. I honestly, really, truly believe, not just from the statistics or the paperwork or the lab results or the countless real-world examples I've seen, but even from my personal experience, having owned countless full-frame cameras and APS-C cameras and now Micro Four Thirds cameras, and drawing on my own experience of what it was like using these cameras. What was the build quality of these cameras? What was the image quality of these cameras? What were they actually like in low light situations? How good did the files actually react to editing and during post-processing? And when it all comes back to, whether it's my personal experience, the numbers, the stats, the YouTube videos, whatever you want to call it, it all points to the same conclusion, which is that Micro Four Thirds is possibly the best system, period. You are not losing anything in image quality. Like I said, it comes down to pixel size, and these days all the sensors have the same pixel size. It's pixel size and computational aspects, and it's all the same these days. There's no difference, and you're not losing anything in image quality, but you are gaining so much in the quality of the camera you're buying, and its features, what it's capable of doing, the money savings, how much money you're going to save buying those cameras and those lenses, the weight savings, how much space and physical weight you're not going to have to accommodate for, just everything. If you want a low light camera, whether you're talking about the great low light performance or the IBIS or whatever else, you want a low light camera, buy Micro Four Thirds. If you want a high resolution camera, thanks to the high res mode, buy Micro Four Thirds. If you want a fantastic sports action wildlife camera, buy Micro Four Thirds. If you want a rugged, durable, will survive anything, submerge it in water, best warranty, best build quality camera, buy Micro Four Thirds. If you want the best hybrid camera for both photo and video with professional level video capabilities, you buy Micro Four Thirds. If you want the best lens selection, Micro Four Thirds. Every single thing you can want to do. You're professional, Micro Four Thirds. You're amateur, Micro Four Thirds. You're on a budget, Micro Four Thirds. Unlimited budget, Micro Four Thirds. It all leads back to the same thing. Now I know a lot of you have been sold on the allure of full frame. The camera companies and the photography industry has done a very, very good job on selling us that the bigger the sensor, the better. To the point that people are now spending $10,000 on Fuji GFX camera because it's medium format, even though it's about the smallest medium format sensor that's ever existed, barely medium format, but it's bigger than full frame, so it's medium format, and somebody's willing to, they're lining up to spend $10,000 on this medium format camera because that's a steal of a deal compared to what a Phase 1 or a Hasselblad costs. Obviously, you can shoot whatever you want. You can spend your money however you want. Do whatever you want. But remember this video. Remember what I said. And the next time somebody tells you that APS-C is just as professional as full frame and the size difference isn't that big, but then turns right around and says Micro Four Thirds is tiny little toy camera that's not up to a professional task, just smile and nod and remember to never listen to that dumb motherfucker ever again.